If you want to learn how to make a top-down dungeon crawler, something inspired by classics like Gauntlet and even Diablo, something that has path-finding enemies and area of effect explosions, something that was the beginning of my own dungeon crawler game, a top-down, couch co-op, action RPG with randomly generated levels and multiple player characters, then keep watching and I'll show you how. G'day gamers, and welcome back to our dual GML and drag and drop top-down dungeon tutorial. In the previous episode, we've built a moving player with a bow that aims at the cursor. In this episode, we'll add a way for the player to fire projectiles from their bow and give the bow some recoil after it fires. So let's add the projectile that will fire when we hold the mouse button down. Now in the description, you'll find a link to a resource file that contains the resources for the project. If you've previously downloaded this, you'll need to grab it again because there are 2 new sprites in the file. So I'm just going to drag in the arrow sprite. First thing I want to do is just grab the origin, and that's the center of the sprite, and I'm going to put it down here at 15:9, just at the front of the arrow. Now I want to change the mask, so inside of the collision mask, you can see by default it's set for the whole amount. I'm just going to change that to manual, and I'm going to drag it to be a smaller amount. I'm going to just place it at 12 and 7, and then 16 and 11. So the positions are down here, and I'm creating a small section for the collisions just at the front here. And that's so the collisions are not so wide, because when we rotate the arrow at different angles, the mask will become larger depending on the angle. So I like to use a small tip at the collision mask, as this will ensure the mask stays fairly consistent when being rotated. So once we've done that, close that down and we can create an object for the arrow. So I'm just going to call it O_arrow, and we can drag across the sprite. And lastly, I'll just hold down Shift, select both of these and drag those into the player. Now I'm going to add a create event for the arrow, and that will run when the arrow is created. Now the first thing to do is just set up some variables for the arrow, and we're going to have a damage variable. And I'm just going to set that to 5, and that'll be the damage that it does when it hits an enemy. I'm going to have a range variable, and I'm going to set it to 160, and that's how far the arrow will travel. And then we've got an owner_ID variable, and I'm going to set that to no one. Now, owner ID will be the ID of the instance that creates the arrow, and no one is a special keyword that Gamemaker knows. It means we're not assigning it to anyone at the start. And lastly, I'm going to have a variable called knockback time. And I'll just set that to 5. And that'll just be the time that the enemy gets knocked back when they get hit. Now there'll be a few times when the arrow gets destroyed. And instead of creating code multiple times, I'm going to create an instance function. So there is a declare a new function here, drag this in, and I'm going to call this arrow_die. So over in GML, we just write function, and then the name of the function, and our open and close brackets, and then our open and close curly brackets. So what do we want to do when the arrow dies? Well, we want to go and set its speed to be 0 because we want it to stop moving. And the other thing I'm going to do is create another instance, and that is an explosion when it dies. So there is a change instance code block. Now I'm going to change it into something called O_arrow_explode. So over in GML, we can just type the function, we write what we want to change this into, and there's also another argument if we want to perform events. And that means will we perform the create event and the destroy event of the new object. So I'm just going to set that to false. So that is an object that doesn't exist right now, but let's create that as well. So we'll take a copy of that. Now then, if we look in the resources, you'll find you'll have an arrow explode sprite. Let's drag that in. And let's set the origin to be the middle center and set its speed to be 14. Now if I press play, it's just a simple animation that we'll use for when the arrow dies. I'm also going to just change the name and take that strip 6 off the name. So now that we have that sprite, let's create an object for this as well. If I right click on an object, I can get a shortcut to create object. And we want to paste in what we copied before. And let's drag in that sprite and drop it there. Now what I want to do with this is when the animation finishes playing, I want the object to destroy itself. So if we go to add event, go down to other, and there is an animation end event. If we select that, then we can just drag in a destroy instance code block or type in instance_destroy. And that way we're cleaning up our object when it finishes its animation. So we have an arrow explode. If we go back to, let's drop that onto player. If we go back to our arrow, so now when we run our arrow die function, we'll change into arrow explode. And after the animation plays of the explosion, the object will destroy itself. Now, the reason we just didn't change the sprite of this into the arrow explode sprite directly is because the code in here will still continue to run. And if we've got collisions with the arrows, they'll still happen. It's just an easier way to do an explosion because you don't have to worry about the code of the arrow interfering when you're doing the explosion. So now that we have that function, let's use that. I'm going to create a step event. And I'm going to declare a local variable, and we're just going to call it _dis, standing for distance. Now in GameMaker, we use VAR to create a local variable, and it'll turn yellow to indicate that. And what we want to do with distance is find out how far our arrow has traveled. So I'm going to use the function called point_distance. And that takes 2 points, x1 and y1, x2 and y2. And if you give it 2 points, it'll give you the distance between the 2 points. So we want to know how far the arrow has traveled. Well, we can use the variables xstart, ystart, which are built-in variables that are created when the instance is created. And we want to find the distance between that and our current x and y position. Now, once we have that distance, we're going to put a check in. And we're going to say if that distance is greater than our range variable, well, that means our arrow has traveled the distance it needs to. We can then destroy it. So over here, we can run a function call and just drop it on the right there. And the function we want to call is our arrow_die function. So what that means is when our distance is greater than range, we will run this function. We'll set our speed to 0 and we'll change into our explosion. Now, the great thing about having that kind of function is we can use it as well when the arrow hits a wall, for example. So let's go to add event. Let's go to collision with our oSolid. And when that happens, we want to run the same function. So go back in here and I'll just copy that function call and then just paste it here. And now whenever we hit a wall, the arrow will die as well. So the other thing I'm going to do is go to add event, go down to other, and there's an outside room event. So when the object travels outside the room boundaries, we want to destroy it as well. Otherwise, it'll continue to travel and your game will build up with objects that you're not using and it'll slow down over time. So just make sure if you're not using an object anymore or if it's left the room, you need to destroy it. So we'll just go here and go to our destroy instance, or we'll type instance_destroy in GML, and that'll make sure it's destroyed when it leaves the room. Now we need a way for the player to fire the arrow. So let's go to our player, and just in the create event where we're creating some variables for the bow, let's make some new variables here. And I'm going to create one for our fire rate, and I'll set it to 30. So that's how quickly we can fire. And we'll make another variable called can_fire, and I'll set it to true. And that'll just be a Boolean, which means it can be true or false, and that'll indicate whether we can fire or not. And lastly, we'll have a variable called arrow speed, and I'll set it to 8. And that'll be the speed of the arrow when we fire it. Now we can make a function to check for when the player presses the mouse button to fire the bow. And once they're fired, we can use an alarm to control the fire rate. An alarm can be set to a particular time and it'll count down and it'll run some code after that time is finished. So we'll use it to limit how fast we can fire, and at the end of the alarm, we'll set our can fire to be true again. So let's go and right click and make a new script. Now I'm just going to call this check_fire. And if you're in GML, you want to just go into your player processor script, and you can just add an extra function down the bottom there called function check_fire. So the first thing we want to check for is, are we holding the mouse down? So I'm just going to drag across an if mouse is down code block. And for GML, you want to do an if mouse _ check button. And you have to type the button that you're checking. In our case, it's MB _ left. So if we are holding that mouse button down, we need to check if our can fire variable is set to true. So if our can fire is equal to true, then we can set our can fire to be false. Now in drag and drop, where you say if can fire equals true, now because I'm doing comparison, I'm writing 2 equal signs. Now you can get away with writing 1 because GML is fairly relaxed with its rules, but it's good practice to learn the correct way, and when you're doing a comparison, you should be writing 2 equal signs. Now instead of writing can fire equals true, I can just write can fire. Because it's a Boolean, if it's true, this is all we need. It's a bit redundant to ask if it's true because if it's true, it'll run anyway. Then we can set our can fire to be false. And then we can set our alarm, which will reset can fire back to true. So we can go here and set an alarm countdown, and we'll set our alarm 0 to be fire _ rate. So back over in the player, let's go and add an event, and it'll be alarm 0. And after the alarm's counted down, we want to set our can fire back to true. Now GML also allows a description here, and the description will appear over on the alarm. This is not available in drag and drop, even though I have requested that they add that because that functionality is pretty useful. So back over in our check fire script, after we've set the alarm and we've set our can fire, we can go ahead and create our arrow. But first I'm going to grab the direction that the arrow is going to fire. So I'm going to drag across a declare temporary code block. So we're setting a local variable and I'm calling it dir, so _dir. Now before we use this method for our distance, and we can do a similar thing for direction with point direction. And it takes 2 positions as well. So where we currently are, which is our X and Y, and where we want to shoot, which is where our mouse is. So our mouse _X and our mouse _Y. Don't forget your brackets, and that will then get the direction from the player to the mouse. And we can use that to create the arrow instance. So I'm going to drag across the create instance, and for the position, I'm just going to set it at relative to 0, 0. So it's X and Y. And then the layer we want to create it on, I'm going to create a new layer called arrow. Make sure that's in exclamation marks because it's a string. And the object we want to create is that O arrow. Now the last thing to do is I want to assign it to a target because I want to capture the ID of this instance. So I'm going to set a local variable, so set it to temp, and I'm going to capture it as _inst, standing for instance. Now that we have that variable, we can actually change some properties of the newly created arrow. And in drag and drop, we're going to use the apply to. And over here, if we click the little drop down, we can apply it to different things. And I'm going to apply it to _inst, which means that everything placed under this code block will apply to the arrow that we created. In GML, it's a bit easier. You can type with and then type the ID of the instance you want to change. So the things I want to change about the arrow are its direction and its distance and its speed. So let's drag across a set instance variable code block, and I'm going to change the speed, and we're going to set it to arrow speed. Now the thing about this arrow speed variable is at the moment we're talking about the arrow because we're using an apply to, so essentially that's putting us inside the arrow. So this variable doesn't exist inside the arrow, it exists inside the player. This is a variable that we created in the player's create event. So in order to access the player, we have to type other.arrowSpeed, and that'll now get the other object outside of the apply to or outside of the with. So whenever you use an apply to or a with, you want to use other if you need to grab a variable from outside of the particular instance you're in. Now the other thing we wanted to set was the direction. We want to set it to _dir. That was the direction we calculated up here. Now it's worth noting that we don't need to use other for a temporary variable or a local variable. It's available for use anywhere in the event that it's declared in. Now setting the direction will set which way it moves, but we also need to rotate the arrow so it's pointing in the direction that we want it to go. And we can do it in drag and drop by changing the image rotation. In GML, it's called the image angle. We want to set it to _dir. Now the last thing I want to do is go and change the owner ID. Now we won't just be using this variable today, but I still want to set it because it's something we'll use later on. And we want to set that to other. So that's the ID of the instance that creates this arrow. And this is the way that you can ensure that the arrow only hits enemies and not the player, for example. So now we can go and create this arrow layer. I'm just going to click on instances, create a new layer, and just call it arrow. And now if we go back to our workspace and go to our player's step event, we can add the function call to our check fire. So I'm just going to do it after we do our calc movement. So now let's test the game by pressing play. And if we hold down, we can fire our arrow. But the problem is the arrow looks very static. We can give the bow some movement by using the bow distance variable, which is how far the bow is from the player. So let's change its value when we fire. So over in our check fire, as soon as we've done the firing, let's go and assign our bow distance variable to set it to 5. Now, if you remember, this is currently set to 11 by default. So let's press play and test that out. So now when we fire, we get our bow having some recoil. But the problem is it doesn't bounce back to its original position. So in order to have it return to that position over time, we can use the Lerp function. So let's go to our end step where we're setting the bow position. And let's use Lerp here to change our bow distance back to its original value over time. And we can just set bow distance to be the Lerp of whatever bow distance is at the moment. And our target's going to be our 11. And how fast we want to move it is going to be just 0.1. So 10%. So that means we're trying to move the variable bow distance to 11 by moving it 10% of the distance at a time. So initially when we're setting it to 5, the difference is 6 between 11 and 5. So it'll move 0.6 the first step, and it'll move 10% of that difference every step. Now by using this variable 11, it's kind of a magic number because if we change the bow distance in the create event, we've got to remember to change it here as well. So to counter that, you could create an initial variable for this and use it wherever you want to use the 11. It's a bit better practice to do something like that, but I'll leave that for you to change. Now let's just test that out. And now we have the recoil of the bow every time we fire, and it moves smoothly back to its original position. That looks great. So that's all for this tutorial. If any of my tutorials have helped you and you want to give back to show your appreciation, or you just want to access the source code or any bonus tutorials, as well as extra videos related to my Keepers of Pyrite game, check out my Patreon page, as these supporters allow me to continue to post content for you. My legendary supporters are Keizaho, Andy K, Colin Litchfield, BB Samurai, Jose Pablo Avila Medrano, and this month's epic supporters are Skydevil Palm, Salvatore Capolino, Dan Half, Edward Lyko, Paul R. LeBlanc, Joachim Froholt, Robert Churches, Sinfuriga, Kareem Butler, Sudu, Luke Bonnet, Sir Peter, and Yuta Momomitsu. A big thank you to these rare Patreons for their support as well. So thanks for joining me, I'll talk to you in the next one.